Imagine that you were born and raised on a First Nations reservation in the United States and Canada. Some of you watching this, I have many fans from Europe. I have viewers around the world. You know what? I have more viewers in Europe than I do in Canada. Let's just be honest here, all right? You may not have a clear notion of what a reservation is or what that means. Suppose you were born and raised on a kind of compound where from birth you're told that your people are sovereign there, that your people constitute the government there, but everyone knows it isn't really true. Everyone knows there's this other government that gives you your driver's license. There's this other government that controls the schools, especially the universities. If you want to go to university, if you want to have a career, that sets all the standards, including, something you see right away as a child, how the highways work. Your so-called sovereign reservation doesn't have its own system of stop signs, doesn't have its own traffic lights, doesn't have its own idea for how, the standard should be for the electrical voltage when you plug in a lamp. Now, this is when you're a child, this is what you notice. If you're a child and you go on vacation in Europe, oh, the street signs are different here. Oh, when you plug in the lamp, the plug is different, right? From a child's perspective, that's sovereignty. That's being a separate country. Oh, people say on this reservation that we have sovereignty, that in some sense we have self-determination, that we have our own government, that we're our own country. It's broadly speaking the case in both the United States and Canada. And yet there's this other sense in which it's not really true. And now ask yourself, growing up in that circumstance, would you want your own children to go to the best university in the United States of America or Canada, respectively? Would you want them to have access to the best education, the same education that wealthy white people have access to? Or would you say, no, I would prefer to have sovereignty, and I would prefer to have my child grow up only being able to go to school and go to university here on this reservation, on this plot of land, on this tiny country, on this microstate, because that means so much to me, that I'm willing to lose access to that university system. Medical care. So what if it's your grandparents? Your grandparents are getting older and older. They're needing more and more attention from doctors. Do you feel that the best thing for your future and the future of your people, the future of your tiny country, of your reservation, is to say, look, we need to close the door once and for all on having access to those hospitals, in principle or in theory, the best hospitals in America, the best hospitals in Canada, the same hospitals that white people use. We need to rely entirely on our own hospitals that are staffed by people educated in our own universities to be our doctors and nurses, so that we have sovereignty. Right? People don't want to think seriously about what sovereignty means. And these concepts, sovereignty, rights, they're regarded as self-evidently good things. They're regarded as if they only bring with them advantages and not disadvantages, as if they don't bring with them, serious responsibilities that have serious consequences for the people involved. I just want to say this. I studied at First Nations University of Canada. If you can't guess from the name, that is Canada's one and only attempt to have a university that is sort of by and for Indigenous people, Indigenous languages, Indigenous culture, Indigenous politics. Now, I'm simplifying slightly. Shout out to anyone who might be watching this video from Blue Quills College. There was another one, Red Crow College. There were a couple other tiny attempts to have little First Nations colleges and universities across Canada. And I could tell you about those too. It's something that really interested me. But my point is, I was on the only example in Canada of a large, well-funded university that was supposedly by and for Indigenous people. Now, when you say well-funded, what do you mean? Again, sovereignty, it's really a distraction here. It's really used in a very misleading way. Of course, that university is paid for by white Canadian taxpayers. And of course, it should be. I mean, if we're one country, this is the reality. And we should do much better. We should provide them with much better university education. But already this is starting to get at interesting questions of, well, do you really want to have a segregated system of university education? Do you want them to have separate, quote unquote, separate but equal universities? Or do you want them to have access to the same universities we do? And if you give them a choice, what percentage of them will choose the segregated system as opposed to choosing the best system? I can repeat this for healthcare, right? Like, even if the hospitals available to them on a segregated basis are just slightly worse, what percentage of them will choose to instead put their grandparents into a white people's hospital? To be brutally honest with the wording, if we start to have segregated healthcare and a segregated education system. And then you can also flip that around. I was a white person who chose to go into their education system. It's so incredibly rare that many people in that system insisted that I must be of First Nations ancestry. And I know I don't look it, but if you've spent some time with these people, the majority of them don't look like it either. That's the reality in 2021. You can't really judge based on appearances because so many of them are the product of generation after generation of intermarriage and so on and so forth. And in many cases, some of them didn't look so different from Europeans to begin with when Europeans first arrived. It's a very subtle difference in facial features. So there were people there who assumed and insisted. I had to say back, no, look, I have no connection in terms of my bloodline to this. I was a guy who had been living in Cambodia and decided to shift gears and get involved in First Nation language and First Nation politics. So this is a digression. But the point of the digression to say is, having spent time around a lot of people who cared about this passionately, I have never once heard or seen anyone talk through seriously the implications of sovereignty for First Nations people. And the word is used constantly. It's wallpaper for political discussions of First Nations people. And really, it's not just wallpaper. It's papering over big holes in the wall. It's like, oh, well, we do have this history of genocide. We do have terrible problems just in terms of like equality in the most basic sense, economic equality or what have you. We do have problems with who does and doesn't have access to clean drinking water. You know, there's all kinds of like unbelievably terrible things with the situation for our First Nation people. But we can just paper over that by saying that they have sovereignty. Isn't sovereignty an interesting concept to use instead of equality, right? Instead of equal opportunity, instead of even equal rights, or instead of, you know, talking about equality with other measures, like, oh yeah, their actual quality of life is just deserved. How about equality of representation? How about how many seats in parliament, how many seats in the Senate, even within a province like Saskatchewan, where they're 10% of the population, where 10% of the population is Indigenous? What percentage of the people in government are Indigenous? What percentage of doctors and architects are First Nations people? Like, talking about equality says, oh, no. Sovereignty, this kind of profoundly dishonest use of sovereignty, becomes the wallpaper that, you know, really distracts us from the questions of what has happened in the past, what is happening now, and what should happen in the future. Tremendously important questions. But just say, when I was on that campus, I never heard anyone talking about sovereignty seriously. And I'll explain in just a moment what I mean by talking about sovereignty seriously. Talking about what I mean in practice. I never saw a YouTube video from anyone. I never read an article like on paper. I never saw any discourse about what sovereignty would really mean if we really give it to them and they really take it. And here's what it would really mean. Vatican City, Andorra, San Marino. There's a tiny, tiny little country in the south of France, famous for its casinos, Monaco, on the Côte d'Azur. That's sovereignty. That's sovereignty. It would mean that when you looked at the map of Canada, there would be a series of microstates that were sovereign. And just like Andorra, if you've never heard of Andorra before, you can Google it real quick, by the way, okay? Just like Andorra, just like Vatican City, they would have a seat at the United Nations. And no matter how tiny they were, even if they were as tiny as Andorra, as tiny as Vatican City, and Canada has a lot of land to give away. I don't know if you look at the map, really, they could be huge in terms of territory, but the population would be tiny. There's not that many people involved here. Okay, but even if you give them a lot of land, all right, that microstate would have a vote at the United Nations equal to Canada. It would have a vote at the United Nations equal to India with more than 1 billion people. And guess what? The Vatican has that right, and the Vatican uses that to great effect. The Vatican lobbies for a conservative Christian perspective, even though we all know there are many ways in which the Vatican isn't a real country. There are many ways in which, no offense, Andorra isn't a real country. I mean, Andorra doesn't have to maintain an army the same way other countries do. But if you really give First Nations people sovereignty, if they really have their own countries, no matter how tiny, and no matter how merely symbolic their military might be, because probably they would not take their limited tax dollars and pour it into building up a mighty military to defend a tiny state that's enclosed by Canada on all sides, right? They would lose access forever to the benefits of being a Canadian citizen, because they would not be Canadian citizens anymore. They would be members of their own sovereign state. Now, you guys, if you've heard of this, you've probably heard of it because of a few American gangster movies. It's an interesting footnote in history that Vatican City has its own banks, right? And those banks are not governed by Italy, and they're not governed by France or anyone else. They only answer to the Pope, because they have their own government and they're sovereign. So in theory, they can be as corrupt as they want to be. They can be as criminal as they want to be. They can be involved in all kinds of international banking transactions that other countries' banks wouldn't engage in. Let's put it this way. If you think Swiss banking is corrupt, Vatican City is able to take on the contracts. They're able to go places that the Swiss would fear to tread, right? Ultimately, Switzerland has a democracy. They have a government that the economic side of things has to answer to, right? In reality, I don't think the scale of illegal banking and black market economics in Vatican City is so tremendous as people think it is. There was one particular gangster, a real historical figure who's still alive and still giving interviews. There was one American gangster who was a courier for Vatican City and who was personally friends with one of the popes during his lifetime and did favors for them. And he personally got involved in the making of several Hollywood movies. He's credited in different ways, but he met and spoke with the people who wrote and directed those movies. And he was an actor in several of them too, playing small parts, I think, to recognize him and reward him for his role and kind of adding authenticity to American gangster movies. But because of this one guy, we now have this view of the corruption of the Vatican City banking industry as if it dwarfs Switzerland, as if it dwarfs Hong Kong, and I just say I'm very skeptical about that. This is one of the effects of Hollywood movies, right? However, there's a seed of truth here, right? Like there's a kind of necessary warning about what sovereignty means. If you grant sovereignty to a microstate within Canada, everyone knows that the one thing everyone talks about is casinos, and many of these microstates are famous for their casinos. What is, in the south of France, what is Monaco famous for? What is Monte Carlo famous for? Casinos, right? Oh, well, other countries make casinos illegal, but here's this small country that feels they don't have a lot to lose, and they become a casino destination. Other microstates may be famous for prostitution. Okay, well, they can also do whatever they want to on the internet. They can do whatever they want to in banking. They can do whatever they want. They can have their own stock exchange. They can have their own stock market. They can do all these things, and they don't answer to you. They don't answer to anyone but themselves, because they are sovereign. That's what sovereignty means. So if we are going to pretend and we are going to sign United Nations declarations stating that our Indigenous people have sovereignty, that the solution, that the way out of our history of genocide is to grant them sovereignty, autonomy, and self-government, what you are talking about is secession. Now, again, we probably have some Europeans in the audience here. And those of you, hey guys, I can see most of the comments. The font is not so good today, I gotta say. Anyway, shout out to Richie, shout out to another person named Richard, shout out to Moondog, shout out to everyone. If you want to hit thumbs up while you're here, guys, it'll help more people discover discover the live stream, join the conversation while it's still ongoing, which is fun. It's nice to have stuff for me to, to reply to spontaneously, as I'm going here. We have a great question from the audience. Why is his shirt so wet?
It's so hot here.
This is June 28th, 2021. And we don't just have a heat wave here in Victoria. We've set a record. Yesterday was the hottest day ever recorded here. And I think today is, again, going to be a record-breaking day. I'm used to it. I used to live in Cambodia. Already mentioned. I'm used to it. I think it's a bit ridiculous. But right now there were government warnings, and the government, they shut down the university. They shut down a bunch of public parks. It's like, oh, stay inside. You're going to collapse from heat exhaustion. Maybe somebody will. But yeah, so right now we're recording it's as hot as a normal day in Los Angeles or South Texas or something. I mean, it's not Cambodia hot, But yeah, it's a real issue. Oh, we have another great question from the audience. Why does J.J. McCullough say the sound ooh so strangely? He is from the genocidal east coast of Canada. My accent, I used to get compliments on this. It's been a few years now. Probably showing the way people's attitudes change. I used to get compliments all the time for people, I mean, in real life, not on the internet. Real life people who talked to me who complimented my accent. And I remember, and these women were not trying to sleep with me. They really weren't flirting with me. But I can remember women saying, wow, you sound like a movie star. And I can remember men more often saying, wow, you sound like a news broadcaster. And what I said back every time was, that's because I'm from exactly the neighborhood in downtown Toronto where all of the news broadcasters and TV actors in Canada come from. And so in the United States, they don't call it a Toronto accent. It's normally called a Great Lakes accent. So I have a Great Lakes urban accent. And for no particular reason, this is also the accent and the way of speaking that is overrepresented on American news. And I would say among American movie actors, it's overrepresented. So my style of pronouncing vowels, it's not represented in the United States as a whole. This is not the way people talk in Georgia. This is not the way people talk in Texas. To mention Texas again, you know what I mean? Actually, if you look at the map of the United States, it's quite a small area of the United States, but it's a huge percentage of the population of Canada, just in this small area, because Canada is a very sparsely populated country. So I do have this distinctive but very familiar accent that people regard as standard or default for the United States and Canada, but it's really not. And yeah, within Canada, JJ's accent is considered the distinctively Canadian accent, whereas my accent is, again, it's familiar from watching news and TV and what have you. I'd point out, actually, sorry, a good point of this is my accent is not the New York accent. A great indication of that. How do you pronounce the word floor? Floor. I say floor. So this is the Great Lakes standard accent, right? The New York accent is flaw. They pronounce it like F-L-A-W, flaw. There was a nail in the flaw, right? This is New York, okay? How do you pronounce church? C-H-U-R-C-H, church. Standard New York accent, choich. Now, let me ask you, even if you watch the news from New York City, even if you watch an action movie set in New York City, will you hear people pronouncing the word floor as flaw? You know, I would say today in 2021, probably not. I think you mostly hear this kind of standardized Great Lakes accent. So yeah, there's an intro. Sorry, talking about cultural genocide. There is something. There's something significant there. So another great question from Moondog. Shout out to Moondog. He says, quote, Eisel, have you read the book Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry? ? What do you think about her writings on the revival of First Nations languages? So Moondog, I have never read that book, and I have never heard of that book. I've never seen the title before. I can guess something about it, from the title. It's an important issue that there's definitely more than one, perspective on. I think I'm going to go on now to talk about language. It's probably it's the next thing I'm going to talk about in some depth, and how that relates to questions of sovereignty and why have sovereignty at all, and questions about rights. And why have rights? So what does any of this mean? What's the point? I mean, all these concepts ultimately are a means to an end, right? Like it's an instrument held in human hands to serve a particular purpose. Sovereignty does not exist as an end in itself. Rights are not an end in itself. It has to be for something, right? And I've already pointed out there are real disadvantages to having sovereignty. So if you are really going to take on sovereignty, it has to be for a purpose. In this same way, First Nations activism of any kind, it really has to exist for a purpose. It has to have motivations and outcomes that they're pursuing. Now, you probably guessed I'm sympathetic to many of the objectives when there are objectives. But I think, just responding to the title of this book you mentioned, sometimes there are no objectives at all. So I knew a guy, really sweet, lovely guy. I really liked him as a person, a First Nations guy in Saskatchewan. And, I'm not naming him for a reason here. I liked him. I really did like this guy as a person. But he was one of those guys who was a chain smoker. He was rail thin. I don't know if he has a history of drug addiction and alcoholism. But having spent time with him, with his manners and so on, that was my impression or my suspicion. Maybe he's just a chain smoker who's rail thin and, he's kind of hunched over. That is the kind of guy he was. But I really liked him. He's I personally liked him, and he wasn't a close friend of mine, but I felt that he was a friend of mine to some extent. Lovely guy. And he started, and okay, I'm going to be honest here. I really wonder if he started doing this because of me. When I knew him, I would point and say, why is that stop sign in English? Why is the no smoking sign in English? And, I'd say, look, everyone knows what the no smoking sign means, like just the symbol. Like, would it kill us as Canadians? Would it be so hard to have the no smoking sign and then have it in Cree or in Ojibwe, to have a First Nations language, to have a native language below it? And, like, if you're a white person, you're not going to feel oppressed by this. Oh, yeah, it's a no smoking sign. You can have English also, you know what I mean? But it's not like, oh, this is a totally new concept of no smoking, right? But like, would it be too much to ask when we're in like the tiny little piece of land that is in theory sovereign, that is in theory First Nations land, and it's supposed to represent them? Couldn't the no smoking sign be in Cree? And, again, if you want to use other native languages, we have Dene in Canada. We have some other languages that are not necessarily going to be extinct. And now, again, obviously he sympathizes with me. He's on my side, but it was shocking and unfamiliar. He'd never heard people talking to him. Okay. Talking to him and talking to many other people there, it seemed like everyone I said this to was very surprised, and they'd never heard anyone say this before. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they were surprised, and 10 years earlier they'd heard someone was like, it's not something people were commonly saying. Anyway, so a couple years after I knew this guy, something reminded me of him, and I Googled his name, and it looked like maybe 1 year after we had that conversation, like not a real long time, but he started a little political movement, a little micro political movement to try to get public signage in the Cree language. Now, it's totally possible that's something he'd had on his mind for 10 years, and then meeting me and hearing me complain about it. He got motivated. Like, I'm not taking all the credit for it, but really thinking, oh, is that maybe I said that in motion? And, I remember at that time, I don't know what came of it. I assume it ended in failure. But this is an example of something that doesn't cost the government millions of dollars, right? This is peanuts. Space program costs a lot of money. Invading Afghanistan costs a lot of money. Putting up no smoking signs is not a lot of money, to support these languages not going extinct. But I remember the official excuse from the government, and this is so Canadian, was, oh, well, if we do it for one Indigenous language, then we have to do it for all of the Indigenous languages. So whether you are in Toronto, or whether you are in Vancouver, or whether you are in Victoria, you can go to a neighborhood called Chinatown. And there are all kinds of signs put up by the government in Chinese, not from business owners, by the government. And there are signs that say no parking, and there are signs that say public parking 1 hour, and there are signs that give you the name of the street in Chinese, right? Because this is fun. This encourages tourism. Oh, it's Chinatown. The government put up street signs in Chinese, and we're like proud of that, right? We take pride in packaging and promoting the Chinese identity of Chinatown. Oh, I'm sorry, where's Koreatown? Oh, I'm sorry, where's Ojibwe Town? Oh, I'm sorry, where's Dene Town? Where's Inuit? Really? Oh, well, if we do it for one native people, we have to do it for, so this is the state we're at. This is 2021, looking at genocide lately and looking ahead to the future of these languages and of these political questions. So I can take it in a few different directions now. I'll speak briefly about J.J. McCullough's own video. Some of you will be here for that reason. By the way, it's great. It's great having you guys here. Obviously, it's a totally unplanned video. 31 people in the audience. If we can get 31 thumbs up, like if more of you hit the thumbs up button, more people will join the conversation. I can respond to some more questions, comments. And also, all right, let's not take, I was just going to say, look, 24 minutes into the broadcast, you can change your mind later. If you give it the thumbs up now and you decide this is bullshit later, you can take the thumbs up back. And also, you can change your mind and give it a thumbs down. I'm totally in favor of that. People can come in here and disagree with everything I have to say and hit thumbs down. But I'm saying, if you hit thumbs up now, it helps more people discover the broadcast. Well, we are delving into this shadow banned area of political discourse, which it certainly is here on YouTube. I've had quite a series of videos lately that are banned on YouTube, incidentally. All right, look. J.J. McCullough plays a very strange game with his public messaging here on YouTube. He makes intentionally obfuscatory political statements that members of his audience are free to interpret any way they want to. His video, only the first half of it is about First Nations. The video he just put up today called Why Canada is a Failure. His video allows a conservative or right-wing member of the audience to listen to what he says and then presume that his real point, his real conclusion is in agreement with their own assumptions or with their own agenda. A centrist or a liberal or even quite a far left-wing person could watch the same video and come to the same sort of self-deluded conclusion that he's on our side. And what he's doing is not refusing to take a position. What he's doing is very carefully positioning himself in a studiously ambivalent way. And we use the word ambivalent with different meanings in English. It is more than one valence. It's ambivalent. It's presenting the audience with a sort of striking and yet ambivalent, political doctrine. And then the audience is free to take it one way or the other. I appreciate that he finally came out and made a statement on this at all. I appreciate that he came out and took a stand. And obviously, in terms of what he says explicitly, there are things there that are to be praised, just in that he's willing to say genocide is bad in 2021. It's not, a huge leap forward or something, but it's interesting that now at this point in history, he's come out and made this particular statement that he's made. He does not comment on whether or not this concept of sovereignty being applied to First Nations is a good thing or a bad thing. He does not comment on what the implications of that are, short-term or long-term. He does not comment on the implications of this concept of rights and how it would apply to them, what that would really mean if it was taken seriously. He states that the Conservative Party, which he's a member of, opposed Canada signing this UN declaration that in theory commits Canada to taking the course of granting sovereignty, rights, and self-determination to Native people. He doesn't say that he agrees with the Conservative Party. He doesn't say, and the Conservative Party were right, and that it would avert terrible problems now in the future. And, a recurring problem, not just with him, but I feel with all conservatives, is that he does not make any statement about what is the future we want or desire, what is the end point that we are moving towards. Now, with that having been said, he does say some critical things about different delusions we had about what the endpoint should be in the past. There are some positive things said about the video. I would not summarize the history of First Nations at all in the same way he does. Doesn't mean I'm offended by it. It doesn't even mean that it's factually wrong. But no, I'm not entirely comfortable sitting through the way in which he summarizes the history of colonialism, genocide, and government policy following after. Nevertheless, an educational video, and it is J.J. McCullough taking a stand on an issue that up to this point he's been loath to take any clear stand on. All right. Now, talking about the future that way really matters. I mean, talking about what is desirable, what is the end state we're moving towards. Okay. So bring this back to sovereignty. Give the example of Hobbema, Alberta. So I'm just going to type that in so you guys can Google it if you don't know where I'm talking about. So Hobbema, Alberta, plenty of land. This is not some tiny island. It's not some case where it would be really difficult for the government of Canada to draw a circle around it and create a separate country. There's no question. This is a viable solution. Oh, sorry. I shouldn't say it's a solution. It's an option. It's possible. All right. What situation do you want to be in 100 years from now? Do you want the people of Hobbema, Alberta? And this, by the way, I'm saying Hobbema because actually there are several different First Nations reservations clustered around it. It's not jurisdictionally all that simple, but you could make it simple. You can change the legal situation. Do you want them to have their own parliament? Do you want them to have their own democracy? Do you want them to have their own hospitals? Do you want them to have their own universities? Do you want those universities to be taught in the Cree language, in an Indigenous First Nations language? Do you want children to be going to school in the native language? Do you want them to be learning math and science in the native language? Do you want to have, for the first time in the history of the world, a biology textbook printed in that language? Do you want them to be able to study biology in their native language and then go to a university where they train to become a nurse in their native language and then they're employed in a university with that language? Is that the end point we're moving towards? Now, if you look at other contested cases of sovereignty in the world, in southeastern Spain, still to this day, there is an ongoing political struggle for Catalan independence. People will say Catalonia, it's referred to in more than one way. There are people who would say with absolutely no hesitation that the future they want for Catalonia is to have universities where the Catalan language is spoken, where instruction in schools is in Catalan, where children grow up with this is their identity, this is their language, that they want, in this sense, a completely separate country with its own tradition. Now, to my knowledge, if you poll them with that question, it's not an overwhelming majority. If you get into some of those hard questions, that at Catalan independence, it's not some kind of open and shut case where 99% of the Catalans want independence. There are a lot of Catalans who have a different view of it, or want to take a middle path and say, well, we can be like Quebec is within Canada and have a special status within Spain. But there are people who want to take a middle course on that. But there's no doubt, if you talk about who are the supporters of the Catalan independence movement, and many of them resent having to learn Spanish. They feel Spanish is a useless language, or that it's inferior, and that the Spanish literature isn't worth reading, and they would really prefer to have Catalan language. Now, I care about all these issues. If you Google my name plus Catalan, you're going to find evidence that I've studied the Catalan language myself, okay? Briefly, to a very shallow and limited extent. Guess what? There's evidence on the internet of that, okay? The Catalan language is very similar to French. The idea that there's something really distinctive and really important about preserving Catalan as a language unto itself, and Catalan literature and so on, as opposed to reading the same literature in French or the same literature in Spanish, it's a difficult delusion to sustain, all right? Just because the languages are so closely related. Now, some of you, some of you may be able to relate to this and some of you may not. In Eastern Europe, one of the sources of constant hostility and tension is that some people feel that a language like Ukrainian really is a separate language with its own history and its own literature and its own destiny, right? But a lot of people feel that these Eastern European Slavic languages, whether Ukrainian or any of its neighbors, that really they are not different enough from Russian to be worth taking seriously in this way, that there is no merit in sustaining what's really just a slightly different dialect or a slightly different way of speaking Russian. Within Japan, there are dialects of Japanese that, from an outsider's perspective, are a totally different language. Like, they're so phonetically different from standard Japanese, so phonologically different, and so they are really different. They have mutual incomprehensibility, right? And you have to ask, are you committed to preserving this separate language within Japan? And here, obviously, sovereignty is not an issue here. You're not talking about a separate country. Or are we going to accept that in the future, there's really one dialect of Japanese, that it's one language, and that that's the future of Japan, and that maybe there isn't something special or worth preserving about this dialect within Japan, even if it has thousands of years of history, and it may have some of its own literature, but people can read that literature in translation, right? They can read it translated or even just transcribed into modern standard Japanese. Now, it's very hard for people to deal with these kinds of questions when it's their own ethnicity, when it's their own language, okay? How about Israel? How about Palestine? How about the Gaza Strip? How about Ireland? Right, so let me say something to you deeply shocking if you're Irish. If the Irish people continue to speak English, there's no reason for them to be a separate country from England. What's the point? Okay, how about Scotland? Scottish independence is still something that polls are taken about, and they've had referenda about it. They've had referendums about it. In English, the plural of referendum is referendums, not referenda. They've had referendums about it. They'll have more of them. What is the point of giving sovereignty to Scotland and having a separate country if they're just going to speak English, right? And what are you doing if you put up a wall between Scotland and England? You're saying, hey, every child in Scotland has to go to school in Scotland, and you have to go to university in Scotland. You have to be part of our education system. You have to go to our hospitals. If you commit a crime, you go to our courts and you go to our prisons, not theirs. Right? And if everyone's speaking the English language, what is it that you're trying to preserve or promote? What really is the point of having sovereignty? Now, in Ireland, some see the future of Ireland 100 years from now as not being an English-speaking colony, right? They see the future of Ireland precisely as being the preservation, promotion, and promulgation of their indigenous language, that their indigenous language and their indigenous identity and that literature and that cultural tradition, that is the justification for sovereignty, right? But I ask you today in Ireland, is that 10% of the population? Is that 20% or what? And I'm not saying what percentage of the population have a passing acquaintance with the indigenous language, but what percentage of the population of Ireland actually read a newspaper in the indigenous language or have even read one book in the last 5 years in that language? I'm not going to claim the percentage, a very large percentage of the population of Ireland today drag their feet through the process of getting a basic smattering in the native language in their school system as children and then never use it again. They're kind of, oh yeah, right, the lyrics of the national anthem. There's some symbolic presence for the language, right? So I just say this is something that has deep and disturbing implications for everyone involved. Now, I want to ask, so look, I'm open to the possibility with Hobbema, Alberta, they have enough land, they have enough population, they have a terrible history, and their current situation is terrible. We can do it. We can make Hobbema, Alberta into the next microstate, and they can have their own seat at the United Nations, and they can have their own army and their own police force and their own courts and their own prison, and they can pay their own taxes to their own government and elect their own representatives. They can do it. Tiny countries within Europe do it. There are all these examples of microstates within Europe, and then they can be responsible for their own sewage system and their own electricity lines and everything else, right? But if they don't speak their own language, what is the rationale for that? What is the reason for putting up that wall and taking on board all those disadvantages of becoming a foreign country, right? And you have to ask yourself, is it just racism? Like, do the people of Ireland feel that their genetic identity is different enough from the English that they should have a nation state just on that basis? For me, racism will never do it. I don't think racism justifies it. I just fundamentally do not think that makes sense, right? There has to be some meaning. And I said this before, sovereignty is a means to an end. It's a means to accomplishing something, right? There has to be a purpose to sovereignty. And if the purpose is just racism, right, I don't relate to arguments in favor of sovereignty at all. And I'm also not supposing that this is some very easy, open and shut decision for the people of Catalonia or for the people of Israel or for the people of Ireland or what have you. And right now, it's very much a question for the people of Ukraine. I don't know how this drops off the news. It's one of the greatest military crises of the last century. And France and Germany and everyone else in Western Europe should be deeply involved in it. But everyone seems to want to pretend that the invasion of Ukraine is business as usual or something. It's a deeply disturbing example. And language politics and identity politics and questions of sovereignty, they're deeply involved in this. Okay, I'm just going to pause 1 sec to look at your comments, guys. Okay, so Richard, I see you have a series of questions here. Okay, so Richard says that would add so much depth and significance to the North American culture that is dwarfed by every other continent. So look, Richard, you're hinting at a really interesting question that I have covered on my YouTube channel a long time ago. When German tourists come to Canada, they want to see First Nations culture. They want to see Native American culture, Indigenous culture. And they pay to see it. They want to see performances. They want to see dances, right? And, white Canadians don't think this way. What do you think they want to see? Do you think German tourists want to come to Canada to see a second-rate imitation of European culture? A second-rate imitation of American culture? What culture have you got, Canada? What culture have you got that's distinctively yours and no one else has got and that you can be proud of, right? And white Canadians don't have this attitude. We're not proud of, First Nations culture. White Canadians have been engaged in a process of extinguishment towards their Indigenous culture. They forced assimilation, extinguishment of land claims, and forced integration and so on. It's been this assimilationist attitude where white Canadians have been raised to think the greatest thing in the world is to be a second-rate imitation of European culture. And then to some extent, what competes with that is the idea of being a second-rate imitation of American culture. I mean, sorry, like I grew up in Toronto. Toronto has a hip-hop scene. Toronto has a reggae scene. Toronto has a punk rock scene, but it's all derivative. None of it is Canadian. I'm sorry, but like the idea of Canadian rap music is a joke. Like, obviously, it's a satellite to American rap music and American culture. Canadian rock and roll, too. I mean, I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be any of these examples. Canadian country music. We do have Canadian country music, but there is no Canadian culture of country music. It's a chapter of, it's a satellite to, American culture. So look, it is an interesting question, but we're not talking about a parallel universe or if we could travel back in time and make a different decision here, all right? The reality of Canada today, and I would say this for the reality of the United States of America, at least the lower 48 states today, like maybe leaving out Hawaii is a slightly different history or something. Let's leave out Hawaii and Alaska. I think that is significantly different, actually. But Canada and the bulk of the United States of America, we are not in a situation of having a hybrid culture in the way that Mexico does. Mexican culture is not the same as Spanish culture, right? And all of them will tell you why, because it's a mestizo culture. Fine, someone's going to correct me. I've never studied Spanish. I'm probably mispronouncing that name. Mestizo. It's a mixed culture, but they have this word for it that they regard positively as mixed in a positive sense, right? Canada and the United States, we don't have a mixed culture. We don't have a hybrid culture of Indigenous and European influences. If you go to a Mexican restaurant, they can explain to you how Mexican food is different from Spanish food. And it is. It's different. There is no Canadian food. There isn't. You can't go to a Canadian restaurant and have them explain to you how our cuisine is different from British cuisine because of the influence of our Indigenous people or because we intermarried with our Indigenous people or appropriated their customs and habits and their ingredients. So it doesn't exist. And I've got to tell you, if we're talking about the lower 48 states of the United States of America, there is no American cuisine in this sense, right? There is no cuisine the Americans can point to in the same way. So this is a very one-sided genocidal culture. Now, again, I think the only exception, you could probably talk about Hawaiian culture in a different, I think Hawaii is actually a counterexample. We can talk about mestizo culture. So there's someone who is himself mestizo is correcting me. It's inevitable. Hey guys, number one for correct pronunciation of Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese. I studied Japanese too. I've studied quite a few languages, but never Spanish. Whether or not I can pronounce French worth a damn is also a fascinating topic. Topic for another video. We'll see how much role French has in this channel, right? Okay, the situation we are looking at is not one of having a hybrid culture that's the product of that long history of colonialism, right? We're looking at a post-genocidal culture. Right. And where even if you go to the res, as someone usefully says in the comments, you go to the reservation, right? What are you looking at? The vast majority of First Nations reservation, the people wear blue jeans and cowboy hats. Sorry, I'm not saying the stereotype. Many, especially the older people, they listen to country music and wear cowboy hats. There are younger people who wear baseball caps and listen to hip hop music. Of course, they play the same video games we do. They live in the modern world. And they go to school and apply for jobs the same as everyone else. The extent to which they are integrated into, and of course it's the product of a history of forced assimilation, so right. But it's not the case that you can't even go to Hobbema, Alberta, and see some kind of alternate culture, alternate society, unless it is a carefully staged performance. Now, I just give you one example of this. What touched me personally. There were a series of, I would say, radical First Nations protests while I was in Saskatchewan. And it was its own little movement that frankly started on Facebook and eventually petered out. But I did sympathize with it. I mean, I did. It was, what do you say? What is the purpose of this movement? Is to say, hey, First Nations people really matter. I mean, ultimately, that's kind of what they were saying, And they were kind of responding to what was fashionable at that time on the internet, which was the flash mob phenomenon. Nobody can remember flash mobs. This is 2021. It's a thing of the past, right? But they would share messages on Facebook with one another. And this is also part of what makes it interesting is until they showed up and joined in the protest, most of these people, you wouldn't be able to tell they were First Nations. They looked like and dressed like, but including their facial features, many of them looked like white people. And again, that's also part of why they thought I was one of them. And I have to say again and again, no, I'm not Indigenous myself. I'm not a Native person. I showed up at one of these events. But anyway, they would come together at one place at one time, and they would play the drum, and they would chant in their native language. This kind of traditional music performance. I forget how long it would last, 10 minutes or something. It wouldn't really disrupt. So it'd be like a shopping mall. They come together, they do this, and they disperse. This is like the flash mob idea, right? And it was a powerful and kind of harmless demonstration. You're saying, hey, we exist, we matter, we have our own political demands, and the government has been ignoring them for decades, and they're going to keep on ignoring them. It's just this kind of message, And and also aesthetically, it was kind of beautiful. It was kind of nice, So I went to one of these with my first wife, today my ex-wife, one of this. And it is just kind of moving. It is just kind of it comes together. You have this sound that fills the room and so on. And everyone in the crowd is chanting. And I said to her, I'm studying the Cree language at that time. Obviously, I'm not remotely fluent in the language, but I've gotten to a level where I've got the basics down. And I said to her, nobody knows the lyrics. Like, this may seem to you like a powerful demonstration of cultural continuity or kind of political revival. But guess what? This is the equivalent of a bunch of us coming together and deciding to celebrate French heritage, but all of us are just chanting ba, 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 because none of us knows a single word in the French language. All right. Like in reality, this demonstration, it's demonstrating more than one thing. It's demonstrating how far down the path we are to language extinction, because nobody here can actually sing a song in their own Indigenous language. Now, why do I even say that? It's partly geography. If you went up to the far north of Saskatchewan at that time, you could meet people who really spoke the language. You could meet people who could really sing a song in their own language. And this is another thing about the history of hybridity and colonialism and genocide. The language wasn't completely extinct. Almost without exception, the people who really spoke the language in the far north were Christian fundamentalists. They were not just a little bit Christian, they were extremely Christian, and they read the Bible translated into their native language and preached in their native language. So again, you might think the people who speak the language are kind of the natural defenders of the cultural continuity and heritage and so on, but no, it's paradoxical, as so many things in history and politics are. So, all right, a comment from Edgy Intellect, that's suitably edgy. Quote, I don't believe in culture. The term as it's used today is an invention of the late 18th century in the historical context of the emerging nation state. Here's my counter argument to you, Edgy Intellect. Culture is the cumulative mass of all the questions we do not ask ourselves. It is an accrued quantum of assumptions that we only have to defend when they're violated. When you walk into a corner store to buy something, you have a whole mass of cultural assumptions, and you don't even question them or think of them or assert them. But in some other country, or you go into a corner store here that's run by someone with very different cultural assumptions, all of a sudden you realize how much this matters. So I don't know how much you've traveled, Edgy Intellect, but the more you travel, the more you live in circumstances that challenge your cultural assumptions, you will realize just how real and meaningful and important this concept of culture is. So give you one example. You go into a corner store that has a cash register right at the front by the door when you go in and out. Okay. And the woman who's standing behind the cash register comes out and follows you and stares at you as you go from aisle to aisle, picking out things you want to buy. In some cultures, that's normal, right? One reason for that would be obviously the fear of theft, right? In my culture, that's totally unacceptable. And anyone, this happens, people will shout out and denounce and cuss out the owner and say, look, I'm never coming back here. And I'm telling you, and they'll even accuse them of being racist or what have you. You know what I mean? Like there'll be real, it can escalate the conflict. That we assume deeply in this culture that I'm going to walk in and I'm going to have the freedom to stroll around and pick things off the shelf and look at them. And, you know, and you could shoplift, you could steal. And quite a lot of theft and shoplifting is tolerated just because of this cultural norm that in that shop, you should be given your space and you shouldn't be hassled and you shouldn't have to answer any questions as a customer. And if you have questions, you have to walk up to them, not the other way around. Like for the other culture, you know, maybe for some other culture somewhere, maybe the assumption is, hey, I shouldn't have to walk up and ask you. You should be standing here next to me. You know, so no, you know, culture is this cumulative, unexamined mass of questions we don't ask ourselves. It's these assumptions built into a situation. And I again, this is why I don't say belief, right? You don't even believe you should be able to walk around the corner store this way or the convenience store or the shop. It's not a belief. It's not a creed. It's not a political principle, right? So yeah, we lean on and live within culture in this way. We inhabit these assumptions. Someone's encouraging me to study Spanish. Imagine how different my whole life would be if, you know. Different politics, different history, different options. Everything would have been different if I'd gone into Spanish, if I'd gone into Portuguese too. Once in a while it crossed my mind. And as was just mentioned, I briefly did study Catalan. So someone in the audience called David says that he is Catalan, and the dichotomy between Spanish and Catalan is getting greater by the day, not because the language is suppressed like France does to its indigenous minority languages, but because of some intricate factors. So David, I'm aware of that. I lived in a region just over the border from Spain in what's called French Catalonia. And we had different groups who spoke Catalan from different centuries, which is interesting. Those are called lingual isolates or linguistic isolates. Just means people are isolated, so they keep speaking the language the way it was spoken 300 years ago or something. This happens. It's a phenomenon. It happens all over the world. To give an example, there were some Germans isolated within Russia who kept on speaking German the way it was 300 years ago or 500 years ago. Now I forget, because they didn't have any contact with the larger linguistic culture. This phenomenon is fairly widespread. But this is what I would say. If you go back and read pre-modern Catalan literature, so we could call it Renaissance literature, I don't really care what period, but if you go back and read Catalan literature that's from before the modern era of the radio and the cheapness of the printing press producing newspapers, Catalan is really not that different from French. It is fundamentally just not that different a language. So, you know, now I'm not saying this to insult you, but, you know, with a language like Cree or Ojibwe, there is a whole different philosophy of life built into the language. There really is. It's profoundly philosophically different. And I can say this to you. You guys know I don't glorify any form of book learning. This comes up all the time with my girlfriend and stuff. I say, look, I don't glorify reading Aristotle. I don't glorify reading Thucydides. I've got some books here that are really great books. I've got Sallust here with this horrifying color. I think I've got Appian here. Oh, no, I don't. Appian is in the bedroom. Oh, no, it's under the mic. Sorry. Appian's off camera, another ancient Roman author. But look, Appian and Machiavelli are here under my microphone. I can talk about how these books are meaningful to me, but I never say if you read this book, it's going to be philosophically meaningful to you too, right? I'm very skeptical about that. I'm very skeptical about what kind of learning is useful or important to what people. But I can tell you, no matter who you are, if you really learn Cree or you really learn Ojibwe, you really learn an Algonquian language, it is philosophically profoundly different. It's profoundly meaningful. It's profoundly interesting. It'll change your life. It'll change the way you think. It'll change the way you dream. Learning a language like that, a totally alien language from an alien language family, and thinking in those words and the way the words connect to one another and the meanings that are there. And yes, of course, it has its own poetry and it has its own literature and has its own mythology. You can get into Korean Ojibwe mythology, these stories about magical animals and things. I've read my share of it, and yeah, that really is something profoundly meaningful, and it could be meaningful for you and you and you in the audience, no matter who you are. So you're saying, I don't do that with Aristotle, even though I'm a fan of Aristotle. I think it's important for the right people to read Aristotle. I don't say that about Thucydides. I don't say that about everything or anything, right? And, my girlfriend right now is studying Chinese, and it's quite hard work for her. A completely alien language like Chinese, it's also rewarding in that way. Now, to give a really low kind of down-to-earth example of that, though, but how Chinese comes into your life that way. Recently there was a diplomatic struggle between Joe Biden's representatives and the representatives of Xi Jinping, so the United States and China. And I was able to watch that, even though there were subtitles in English. Some of the videos I didn't have English translation. Some of it had subtitles in English, some of it just had subtitles in Chinese. And, the English translation will never really capture the mood and spirit, and in a low-level sense, the philosophy built into what they're saying in Chinese. There's something there, even with something this is relatively meaningless. This is the government of China, saying to the United States, "Hey, don't cross us. We can really, we can really make you regret it," or something. But whoa, there's something really meaningful and really rewarding, about hearing that in Chinese. And obviously, you have to have the level of education to appreciate what's going on in Chinese, or whatever. Can you have that experience with Cree today? Can you have that experience with Ojibwe today? Can you have that experience with Mohawk or Dene today? Will you ever? Will there ever be a situation where a politician stands up and says about the Prime Minister of Canada, or it could be a provincial leader, says about the Premier? That's in Canada, that's the equivalent to being the governor of a state, but stands up and in their own language is denouncing and criticizing another politician, and you've got the subtitles in English, and it's being broadcast in the native language. But where if you study the native language, you can appreciate something that's going on there, philosophically and emotionally, that there's something, For some countries in South America, that's totally easy to imagine because their indigenous languages are not that close to extinction. They have the numbers of people speaking it. They have elected representatives. So I think an interesting contrast would actually be New Zealand. Is it possible that in the future of New Zealand, that the study of the native language is rewarding and meaningful in this way, right? But even to have such a kind of humble set of expectations or questions when talking about the native languages in Canada, it's very hard to see the way forward to a situation that's just even that positive, where we're not perpetually on the cusp of total irretrievable genocide and the disappearance of the language, the disappearance of the culture in every meaningful sense. Obviously, it has already disappeared from politics, and that's the most important thing to disappear from at all. They do not have a presence in our parliament, in our city halls, and so on and so forth. They have been silenced in the most important way possible for all these decades, for all these years, for all these centuries. So we get some more. Thanks, guys. Thanks for these contributions. Some more intelligent comments about Catalonia. And a question from Lilac Cloud. Welcome back to the show. Lilac Cloud is such a memorable name. I remember he or she whenever they're here because of this name. Lilac Cloud says, quote, "Do you think the Canadian movement," interesting choice of words, "do you think the Canadian movement should implement integration programs for the Indigenous people and non-natives?" Okay, so this brings us back to the question of sovereignty and rights in a big way, right? Okay, immigration. Do you think that people who immigrate to Canada from Pakistan have any respect for our Indigenous people and culture and language whatsoever? Have you met and spoken to some Pakistani immigrants about how they feel about our indigenous people? Have you? Do you think that immigrants from South Korea have any respect for our indigenous people or their natives, their language, pardon me, our indigenous people, their native languages, native culture? Do you think there's any positive connection there whatsoever? Take a look. With the South Koreans, there is one interesting footnote, which is that some of them come over as Christian missionaries, and some of them go out to live with the native people to preach Jesus to them. I've spoken to one of those people. Right? How about Vietnamese immigrants? How about Chinese immigrants? How about immigrants who just got off the boat from Sweden, somewhere in Europe? Okay. Most of these people come over and they have a very clear notion of what they want Canada to be for them and what the role of the English language is in their lives. Less often, it might be the French language. It's very rare that people come over here because they want to live in a French language context, and they have absolutely no sympathy and they have no positive engagement whatsoever. And they tend to have an incredibly negative set of attitudes and engagement with Native people. Okay. If you give them sovereignty, then they can solve that problem on their own territory, where they can say, hey, this is the sovereign state of Masquachese or whatever they want to call it. They might use a completely original name. They might use the name that's already used for their tribe or for their reservation, right? Whatever they choose. But again, I'm not talking about one microstate. Throughout Canada, you could have a bunch of microstates the same way that throughout the European Union, there are a bunch of microstates. And then they could say, look, we get to decide whether you're here on a short-term work permit, whether you're here as a tourist, like what your legal status is here, or whether you're allowed to immigrate. And, if you had a requirement for immigrants just to learn a 500-word vocabulary in Cree or Ojibwe, of course that would transform everything, change everything in Canada. And if you'd had that requirement for the last 200 years, everything would be different today. And of course, if they had the ability to do that on their own territory, say, look, if you want to live here, if you want to be part of our life and society, naturally, you're not going to require total fluency. We don't require total fluency in English. We have literally millions of people in the United States and Canada who come here from Korea and they just speak Korean their whole lives. They never learn English. Come here from China, come here from Pakistan, whatever. And they either speak very minimal English or never learn English at all. It's very common. So obviously you're not going to be expecting, perfection from people. But sure, it would change everything if you had language requirements for immigrants. And if people regarded this as something that they were proud of. This was something that's like, hey, you know what? Canada is not like other countries. Canada is not just another second-rate imitation of Europe or a second-rate imitation of some that have in the United States. There's something really special. There's something really distinctive here, and we get to be a part of it, even if it's by learning these 500 words, in this language. Okay. Sovereignty comes at a price. Sovereignty comes at a terrible, terrible price. Okay. If you really want to have a sovereign country for the native people of Canada, that means they've got to rely on their own tax money. It means they've got to build their own universities, and they've got to say to their children, no, you don't get to go to that university. You have to go to this university. It means they have their own court system. It means they have their own police. It means they have their own prison. It means they have their own responsibilities. And if you studied political science, then you will be familiar with the canard from first year political science. You might learn this in high school. You might learn it in university, that there is an important relationship between rights and responsibilities. I think we learn this concept so early in life that we forget what that relationship is or why it matters at all. It's the easiest thing in the world for the United Nations to make a proclamation on paper saying that our native people have rights. I think the whole concept of rights is a really dangerous and self-defeating distraction. Okay? Any major city in the United States and Canada, this is probably true in Europe too, and most of the democratic world, most of the world that has elections and newspapers, and the other kind of cultural assumptions that come along with having elections and newspapers that criticize the government. Okay? In large parts of the world, there are no formal rights granted to the inhabitants of the city of New York or to the inhabitants of the city of Toronto. They don't get to stand up and say, hey, It's our human right that if we don't want a highway built there and we don't want a train line built there, that we can prevent it. You don't have a right. You have a mayor. You have a government. You have a democracy that can contend these issues. Okay? It is pretty common in the world that a higher level of government, the federal government or the state government or the provincial government, that a higher level of government wants to build a highway or wants to build a train line that would be convenient at a large scale, at a national scale, or at an international scale. But that there are local people who have, for some reason, right or wrong, say, no, 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 don't build that highway, don't build that train line, don't build that project. Okay? And they don't rely on rights. They don't rely on sovereignty. They don't claim that the city of New York is sovereign. They don't claim that the city of New York has an inalienable right. They don't rely on human rights. They'll say, hey, we have a human right to not have a highway or a train line built here, okay? They have a mayor who can stand up in the newspapers and stand up in his own government and who can argue the case and say, no, 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 we have some really important set of reasons why the highway should be over there and not over here. And that's normal politics. This is exactly what our indigenous people have been utterly lacking in the United States and Canada for their entire history, down to and including today. Many of my viewers are Europeans. As mentioned, I have a lot of viewers from Australia and New Zealand too. So I know you may not be able to write this. So he's like, okay, I promise you, people in Texas know the name of the mayor of New York. They do. People in California know the name of the mayor of New York City. Sometimes they know the name of the mayor of Detroit too, because the mayor of Detroit gets into the news a lot, right? Do you think people in California can name the leader of the Lenape? Do you think people in California can name the leader of the Ojibwe? Anyone, just one. One leader for one group of Native people who is ever on the news, standing there, speaking on behalf of the issue of the day, even if it is something as trivial as whether the highway is built here or the train line is built there. Okay? Do you see what a dangerous distraction it is to speak in terms of absolute rights or absolute sovereignty? That's not what you need. What you need is a working political system. All right? And when I use the word working advisedly, because it's not going to be perfect. Sometimes, like, the mayor of New York may stand up and say, there's no way we can allow this highway to be built. You know what? It's bullshit. You know what? Once the kind of public discussion goes on and it's covered in the newspapers and it's covered in the press, you know what? It turns out that there were just a few rich people who own some property and their property is going to be destroyed by building this new highway. But really, that's where the highway needs to be. Really, millions of other people are going to benefit. And you know what? Maybe those rich people have been paying donations to the mayor. Like that. This is common. Again, I don't know whether you're in Europe or Australia, you've probably heard some stories like this about particular. It could turn out that, you know what? Once you do the research, once you really think about it, you know what? Local democracy is not always right. Maybe, on balance, some people don't like it, but you know what? We should build that highway anyway, or you know what? We should extend the train line through that neighborhood, whatever the case may be. Right? Politics has trade-offs. It has hard decisions. Right? It has compromise. It has negotiations. It has public discourse and journalists in the press criticizing you. Right? Politics does not proceed on the basis of human rights claims. Ever. It's a complete dead end. It's a complete cul-de-sac. It's completely counterproductive to pretend Native people have sovereignty when they don't, and pretend that they have rights over these things when they don't. And pretending more is not going to solve the problem. What will solve the problem is really granting them their own mayors, really granting them their own provincial premiers, their own governors, their own state senators, however you want to think of it or put it, where they really have a voice. And again, that voice is going to be wrong sometimes. And I think it's a very telling measure. Everyone in the United States of America knew the name Kwame Kilpatrick. Sorry, if you're European, I realize you won't know this name. I know even Canadians all knew this guy's name, Kwame. Who was Kwame Kilpatrick? He was the mayor of Detroit. What did he accomplish? What did he even have conflict with the federal government? Nothing. He didn't accomplish anything great, but he was a powerful voice on numerous trivial issues. Just being real. Sorry, but Kwame Kilpatrick, he didn't build the pyramids. He didn't accomplish anything great in his time in office. He had his controversy. Everyone in the United States of America knew this guy, and they perceived him, rightly or wrongly, as a great leader a great representative for African Americans. He's still alive. You know what? I actually think the history isn't over with Kwame Kilpatrick. You know what? It's possible. It's possible he'll end up vindicating his name and he'll be remembered as a great leader for Detroit or a great leader for African Americans. I doubt it. It's looking pretty bad in terms of how the history books are going to be written on Kwame Kilpatrick. But at that time, before he went to prison, before he was kind of denounced and what have you, sure, that's what Kwame Kilpatrick was symbolically and actually. Okay. We don't have one Kwame Kilpatrick for Native Americans. Okay. We haven't had one in the United States during my lifetime. We haven't had one in Canada during my lifetime. And if you just look at the map, obviously there has to be more than one. Obviously you can't have one guy who represents New York and California and all Native people in Alaska and Hawaii both, right? There is no tribune for them, right? There is no seat in Parliament. There is no seat in the Senate. There is no mayor for them. There is no system of government for them. And it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's a direct consequence of, it is the direct legacy of a colonial system of government that aimed at, quite intentionally, their extinguishment, their eventual disappearance.